So let me welcome everybody to the 4th episode of In Conversation with Choices, where we get to the nitty-gritty of various aspects of languages. Now, before we jump into today's episode, I'd love to add a personal touch to set the stage. Now, picture this: Hong Kong, 2016, amidst the buzz of an international linguistic conference. Now, it was there when I first connected with Kate. We bonded over a conference dinner, finding ourselves truly on the same wavelength. And I really, truly hope I didn't misinterpret that, Kate. The next day, I had the privilege of chairing a session where Kate delivered an insightful presentation that actually later on, I think at least bits and pieces of that presentation made our way into the book that we've contributed to. Now, also, our collaboration obviously didn't end there, but later I was editing this book and I was determined to have Kate contribute. Now, despite her whirlwind move from one country to another, and these were not neighboring countries, right, Kate?
As far away as they could get.
And with everything that was happening in her life, I remember practically begging Kate to write this chapter for me. Now, I firmly believed that her voice was crucial for the volume, and true to her nature, she graciously accepted, and she delivered one of the most inspiring chapters in the book. These are those, testaments to our journey together, and I'm thrilled to have Kate with us today. Now, my first question is going to be nothing about the media, nothing about what, they did to us, but do you still remember this Hong Kong adventure, Kate?
Absolutely. And I remember that it was so hot and humid, and I'd come from Vancouver and I exited my hotel and, I was all freshly dressed and showered. And immediately I came out the door of the hotel. I thought, I need another shower. It's so hot. But yeah, I remember meeting you and had a lovely time. Yeah.
Absolutely. Right. So what I also remember about this session, Kate, that I was chairing, I remember that, emotions got in the way. It was a big thing for me back then. And I completely forgot I was supposed to introduce you and your talk. And then you asked me, do you want me to introduce myself? I was like, oh, so embarrassing.
I do not remember that at all.
I do, unfortunately. But I'm definitely not repeating that mistake again. So here we go. Kate's a researcher at the University of Queensland Business School in Australia. And her expertise is in critically evaluating how people and organizations use language to communicate about themselves and shape the world around them. Kate's also committed to doing research that promotes justice and equity and helps government, the media, and industry communicate for the common good. Now, obviously, this is something that most people can read about you on the website, on your professional profile of your university website. But I was wondering whether you could briefly introduce yourself and share your journey in becoming a communication studies researcher.
Yeah, sure. So I think this journey started about 30 years ago, and I was at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia, and I was working full time, but I just felt like I wanted to study some grammar because I'd never learned traditional grammar at school. And the program coordinator at the University of New South Wales persuaded me that traditional grammar was old hat, and what I really needed to study was called systemic functional grammar. So I gave it a shot and I really enjoyed that course. And that led on to another course, which was on critical discourse analysis.
Mm-hmm.
And that was when I fell in love. And I felt like up until then, I didn't know what to do with my life. But at that moment, I knew what was my calling in life. Yeah. So from there, I actually, I do have a religious faith, and I went on to do a second master's degree, which was in spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
And then I brought those two master's degrees together in my PhD, and I analyzed how religious people and non-religious people, but people from a variety of religious faiths and none, how they talk about social issues, especially controversial social issues, and what that says about them and how they construct a religious or non-religious identity through talking about those social issues. So that's my journey. I did that PhD at Lancaster Uni, and then I got a job at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And then 5 years ago, I moved here to Queensland and joined the business school, which was very unexpected for me. But I came here to teach communications to business students and to do research around the same sorts of topics.
That's one exciting professional journey. And Kate, what a wicked idea, being just graduating from high school and, wanting to learn more about grammar. You're one of the very few people who I think had this idea. but can I pick up on, two things that you mentioned? You mentioned grammar, and you also mentioned discourse. Lots of people nowadays, I think, still conceive of linguistics as if it was, an old man sitting in an armchair and thinking about various grammatical constructions. And that's linguistics for most people nowadays, right? But you've also mentioned this discursive slant. Can you basically tell us what the difference is between the grammatical approach to language and the discursive approach?
Yeah, sure. And I will just say, I have to confess that my first introduction to linguistics was the movie with Audrey Hepburn, My Fair Lady. And Professor Higgins taught her how to talk like a lady. And I just loved that idea. So, of course, with linguistics, there's grammar, there's phonetics, the sounds of how big the sounds people make when they're speaking. But discourse is more about social action. So how language is used to do certain things and what perspective we're adopting when we're using language and how we shape our own identity, how we interact with other people, how we build relationships and power. And so discourse is much more of a social kind of take on language as opposed to just the formal structure of the language. It includes that, but it's more than that.
So you mentioned this movie. What was your takeaway? Like, you're saying it was inspiration. In what ways was it inspirational for you?
I think before then, it hadn't really come through to me so clearly how powerful language is and how language creates social relationships and identity. And the notion that language is central to our social structures and that it can keep some people in power and exclude people, that whole sort of social dimension of language came through really strongly in the movie. And I was very young when I first watched it. And of course, I loved Audrey Hepburn, but I also just found it fascinating that changing the way you speak or changing the way you communicate can change everything about your social status.
Right. So it is kind of reminiscent of the 1970s or 80s Great Britain and Margaret Thatcher, when she was actually taught how to properly articulate words to sound more convincing and more in power, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, our public leaders have a whole teams around them teaching them how to communicate, and some are more effective than others. And some of them sort of break out and do their own thing. Trump, for example, in ways that you would never imagine could be effective, and then they actually are for various reasons. But it's that social aspect of language and communication that really intrigues me.
All right, wait a second. You were saying that you think Donald Trump is being schooled or is instructed on how to talk to people?
Oh no, sorry, I meant he's one of those breakaway types.
Oh, right.
No, I think he communicates in a way that most people prior to his political success, most of all those communications teams would think that's not the way to do it. And yet something about he tapped into an audience and he knew how to talk to that audience. So I was using him as a counter example of probably
Sorry, misunderstood.
What most politicians don't do. But strangely effective, right? I mean, it succeeded beyond most people's expectations.
Yes, and we can see Donald Trump like personas in the political world mushrooming across the globe, don't we? Yeah,
that's right. That's right.
Interesting, worrying.
It's very worrying, and some really you and I haven't talked about this before, but some really leading researchers in the discourse analytic field, Ruth Vodak, for example, talk about the normalization of incivility and how this style, this aggressive, alienating style of communication that marginalizes and demeans people is becoming more normal. And what would previously never have been accepted or never have been thought to be appropriate from a political leader is becoming more and more a common and normal, and it's a bad movement, right?
Yes. From all sorts of perspectives, absolutely. I'm on the same page here, Kate. But coming back to our main topic,
Yes.
the media. Can you start off with the concept of bias in the media? And people often say that this and this newspaper is biased, this TV channel, or this news program is biased towards the left, towards the right. So what does bias mean in this context? And is it possible, or is it simply a utopian idea to think of the media as being able to be completely objective and fair to everybody?
Yeah, I mean, I think all communication comes from a certain perspective. I don't think it's possible to get away from that. And just a very simple example, when I'm speaking to my daughter, I'm mostly talking to her as her mum. But when I'm speaking to my students or I'm writing an academic article, I'm mostly expressing myself as a scholar. And those are very natural and acceptable perspectives or expressions, and we wouldn't call them bias, but we have different expectations of the media. There's a sort of understanding that the media should be objective, that it should present facts, that it shouldn't preference one side or another. And that's a very noble ideal, but I don't think it's actually ultimately possible. I think perspective comes through in so many ways, and the words that journalists use to label people and to describe events, they're never neutral. And especially, for example, in conflict situations, how do you label one side or the other? Is one the aggressor? Is one person right or wrong? And the words we choose can very subtly sort of signal which side we're leaning to. And I don't think we can get away from it. But as linguists, we can raise awareness of it.
How do we do it then? How do we raise awareness of this bias in the media, or simply taking sides?
How do we raise awareness of it? Yeah, well, I mean, I have modeled my academic career on being a public intellectual. And so not just sticking to other academics and writing papers for other academics, but trying to publish more widely, trying to get the research out there to actually raise people's awareness. I mean, recently, on Monday this week, there was an article published in the Washington Post by Paul Fari, and he talks about a war of words on reporting on Gaza and Israel. And this kind of article that he has written is similar to what linguists do, except he's got a really great platform for getting the message out. So he asked, for example, should the armed men, people who crossed from Gaza into Israel, should they be called terrorists? CNN and Fox News use that word. Should they be called militants? The BBC and Washington Post use that term. Should they be called fighters? Al Jazeera use that term. Should they be viewed as terrorists, part of a terrorist organization? So Business Insider magazine used that term. Or should they be viewed as part of the governing power in the Gaza Strip, which is what the New York Times called them? So it's a wonderful sort of popular newspaper article that talks about exactly the kind of thing that linguists pay attention to.
Right. And he's not a
Yeah.
linguist by training, is he?
No, but journalists, that's their trade in words, and also lawyers, right? So Vanessa Otero, she's a former lawyer. She developed what she calls the ad fonts media bias chart. And it's sort of like a graph that maps the world's media from high to low, left to right wing perspective, and high to low reliability. And sources like the BBC, the ABC, Al Jazeera are all, according to this chart, relatively middle bias or balanced bias. So that means they may show some extreme right-wing perspectives on some occasions, and they may show some extreme left-wing perspectives on other occasions. And overall, they end up being like balanced with high reliability. The Guardian and the New York Times are also deemed to be have high reliability in terms of factual reporting, but they're more left-wing. Fox News, more right-wing. So
that's a different story, isn't it? Yes.
Yeah. So that's paying attention to a chart like that, getting to know media sources and where are they coming from and what are their biases. And some of your listeners might not yet know about The Conversation. Conversation is a fantastic online newspaper, which has the requirement that all of its authors have to be academics. They only they don't buy stories. You don't get paid for writing, but they only commission stories from people who are experts on the topic that they're writing about. So everything's coming out of a research base. So that I find that to be a very reliable news source, although it is left-leaning. So you've got to be aware.
Right. So how, media, I think we can both agree with that they play with words, right? That they cater to different political tastes. But why would they do it in the first place? We know that, I think it's taught in primary schools across the globe that, the media can be conceived of as fourth power or fourth estate. We've got the legislative, executive, and judicial. But why would they, want to cater to different tastes and to different standpoints? What's the reason, do you think?
Oh, you know the reason, my dear friend. They're selling papers and they're selling advertising. So, they have an owner or an ownership group which has its own political perspective, and they target particular audiences. They know what the perspectives are of those audiences, and they're selling ads to companies. So ultimately, they're trying to make money.
Right. So yes, it seems that like you could, in a way, compare it to politicians whose opinions and standpoints basically depend on opinion polls, right? So they basically tell people what they want to hear, and it seems that it's a very, very similar story, isn't it? Right.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Yeah, so Kate, we've already established that media use specific language. They are very much aware of the language that they use. They obviously employ language specialists, that is journalists. But there is also this question of media shaping what we think and how we talk about various things, right? Can you sort of help us out in understanding this phenomenon with some examples?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of research that documents media representations influencing how people make sense of social issues. And so just one example, there's a really great study from 2011, so it's a little while ago now, but it looked at how the news were reporting on climate change in the years 2007 and 2008. So that's, it's a little while ago now, maybe before there was such widespread consensus as we see today. And Laura Feldman and her colleagues published a content analysis. So just going through and actually looking at what they were saying as opposed to the language they was using to say it with. And the content analysis of climate change coverage, they compared Fox News, CNN, and MSNBC And they found that Fox News, not surprisingly, used a more dismissive tone. They were sort of refuting climate change. Fox News also interviewed a greater ratio of climate change doubters compared to believers. And so the coverage was very much sort of saying climate change isn't happening. We shouldn't be believing it. It's not important. Don't worry about it. And at the same time, a survey found that Fox News viewers had lower acceptance of global warming than the viewers of CNN and MSNBC. So that's just one example that shows that the way the media coverage was presenting climate change was probably already speaking into a group of people who doubted it, but it was consolidating that doubt.
Right.
Wasn't challenging the doubt. Yeah. And then I noticed a couple of years ago, the Guardian newspaper, you might have also noticed, they made an editorial decision to change the way they talk about climate change. And so they've recommended to their journalists, instead of using the phrase climate change, to talk about climate emergency or climate crisis or climate breakdown, because they're more accurate representations. Climate change is sort of a bit too soft to get the message across. And the same thing with global warming.
Emotions, isn't it?
Sorry, what's that?
It's also imbued with emotions, isn't it?
Yeah.
And climate change is, yeah,
that's right. And instead of calling it global warming, the Guardian editors are recommending calling it global heating, because it's actually, it breaks through people's indifference and gets the message across. So they haven't banned those milder terms, but they're recommending using the stronger terms to try and speak to the seriousness of the situation.
Yeah, absolutely. If there's no emotional investment, people will not take action, will they? Right.
Yeah,
and when you were talking about Fox News hosting lots of climate change, or what is that? Climate emergency, global heating, disbelievers, right? People who basically wanted to debunk the very existence of climate change. I thought of one devoted fan of Fox News, and that's obviously Donald Trump, right? Who chooses not to believe that climate change exists at all, or simply that it's not human caused, right? So yeah, but there's a bit of irony in the semantics of believing in scientific facts, isn't it? Like, I believe, I don't know, that the Earth is round, or well, we've got flat earthers there. But yes, I mean that there is a bit of a twist, right? Here that we believe in science rather than trust it, whatever. But it's a sort of it's a frozen idiomatic language, right, that we use with regard to scientific facts. And so there's a bit of a shame. So
it is. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. The floor is yours. Yes.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, just in terms of language changing and how media represent things, that there are sort of, I think that maybe there's a bit of a backlash now. I'm reading more and more, unfortunately, but there has been a lot of change around LGBTQI identities and how they're written about. And, in much more positive or neutral terms instead of disparaging terms. And so I think that's been very important in changing social attitudes. And, the way we talk about things shapes people's understanding of things. So, that's kind of a good news story that that the way people are talking about sexuality and gender has changed, and attitudes have also changed. And the not so good thing is the backlash, of course.
Yeah. Well, speaking of gender and speaking of research, right? You've done your share of research on media representations of gender inequality and violence. So my fundamental question is, what inspired you to study how the media reports on gender inequality and violence against women and girls? And can you about that?
There's been a tremendous amount of research on this area going back at least 3 decades, and I've been aware of that research through my own journey. I really deeply respect people who work in that area. It takes a lot of courage. It's exposing yourself to some really horrible messaging over a long period of time, and not just at a distance, but up close in the actual nitty-gritty of the words. So it's emotionally and psychologically difficult work, but I think it's very important because of what we've just been talking about, how the media can shape opinions. And when I moved to Queensland 5 years ago, I'd been in Canada for 20 years, and I wanted my research agenda not just to be things that I'm interested in, but things that are sort of geographically pertinent here in Australia and the region. And so I spent some time sort of re-familiarizing myself with the region, because I am Australian. And one of the things that came through loud and clear to me was the very high rates of violence against women and girls in the Pacific Island region. They have some of the highest rates of violence in the world. And interestingly to me, despite those 3 decades worth of research on this topic, I couldn't find any research on how the media in the Pacific Island region address the topic. And so I thought, surely there's got to be something there, or at least let's try and find out if there is something there, how high these rates of violence are, what's the media saying. So I took some time to do that and looked into that. That was one of the papers that I've published in the last year or so.
So what are the media saying then?
Yeah, so my research in a nutshell found that there's very little explicit reporting on gender equality. And the reporting on violence against women and girls has some of the problematic features that have been found in media elsewhere in the world. So one example of that is presenting violence as a series of isolated incidents instead of a structural social problem, a systemic problem. Another problematic feature in the reporting is giving really strong prominence to the perpetrators and law enforcement agents, and more sort of giving those voices more airtime than either the survivors or the advocacy groups or the healthcare professionals who are supporting them. And so you've got this sort of displacement of who gets to talk about the issue. Downplaying and trivializing violence, so using euphemisms and vague language that sort of gloss over what is really very serious, and conversely also sort of sensationalizing and going into too much detail and sort of making it a voyeuristic sort of interest. So those are some of the problems, and oftentimes they're actually those stories come out in the courtroom beat. So the journalist who's covering the law courts, and they're reporting on what's being said in the courts. And in court still these days, unfortunately, lawyers who are trying to defend a perpetrator, get them off, will use various myths about rape or violence to discredit the survivor or to make it not seem so serious. And sometimes the journalists are reporting those myths and perpetuating those myths in the newspaper, because they're just repeating what's been said in court.
Yeah.
So, yeah, quite a few problems.
Right? Yes.
Yeah.
Right. That's a shame. That's a shame. And yes, well, congratulations on basically, bringing this up to people's attention, both within the academia and outside the ivory tower.
Yeah.
So, I'm just wondering, Kate, how did you proceed with, your analyses? How did you come to obtain the results that you've obtained?
Yeah, so I searched through the newspapers that are published across 11 Pacific Island nations in English. I only have the capacity to do it in English, not the local languages, but I took the top English paper from those 11 different countries for 2 years. So from June 2017 to May 2019. And Some of the countries publish their papers daily, some of them weekly. So there's a little bit of variation in terms of sort of how many newspaper articles came from each country. But in a nutshell, I used some search terms that are used by a group called Pacific Women Shaping Development. And that is a program supported by the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade that seeks to improve the political, economic and social opportunities of Pacific women, and ending violence is one of their main aims as well. So the Pacific Women Agenda, when they are working on eliminating violence, they've got some sort of key terms that they use. So I searched all of those 2 years worth of articles for those terms. So they're terms like violence against women, rape, but also some terms that are sort of unique to the region. So for example, sorcery and bride price. So those are sort of some cultural things that can be connected to violence. And I found in those 2 years, 720 articles that returned from those search terms, but only 150 articles that were directly related to gender equality. So in a nutshell, there's a lot more coverage of the violence than there is of gender equality as a concept. And so that could be playing into normalizing violence. And there are some sort of cultural issues around the idea of gender equality. So perhaps the media needs to be finding ways to report on that more explicitly to break down the resistance to that concept. Yeah.
Can I pick up on two things? So the first thing, you mentioned those context-specific or geography-specific words, such as sorcery and bride price. What does, well, we kind of know the meaning of those words in isolation, but within the cultural context, what do they mean?
Yeah, so particularly in Papua New Guinea, there has been over a number of years sort of fears of people being involved in sorcery, in witchcraft or magic, and sort of evil magic. So, for example, if you're in a remote village and someone dies, the members of their family may blame a particular woman in the village, like, you did sorcery on my uncle, you killed my uncle. And then the violence is directed towards that woman.
Oh, right.
It's actually not only women who get accused of being involved in sorcery. It can be men as well. But there's this sort of spirituality that is ongoing, even now in our so-called secular world, where people really genuinely believe in the power of magic, and they will perpetrate violence against someone who's accused of that. So that's a foreign concept to people in Australia and Europe probably, but that's quite prominent actually. There's been some really horrific violence.
And importantly, this violence also includes sexual violence.
That's right. And it is largely gendered. It is mostly women who are accused of sorcery, but not exclusively. And then bride price. So that comes from the notion that there's an economic exchange when a woman gets married, and if the new husband isn't satisfied with his wife, he may resent having paid the bride price, or there might be some conflict or argument over how much the bride price should be. So there can be violence brought against women because of some sort of dispute around the bride price.
Right. Yeah. Horrible stuff. Right.
Horrible stuff.
Yeah, but when I think of, like, you sitting down and reading 720 papers, I also think horrible and tedious.
Yeah, well, do you know what? What I didn't realize until I got into it was the emotional effect it would have on me. And later, because I was doing it sort of in isolation, here I am in a business school, and none of my colleagues were working on this with me. And I later realized that the researchers who do this kind of work, they never work in isolation. They work in a team. They can debrief with each other. It's pretty traumatic. And so I found I could only work on it for a short period of time, and then I had to have a break. And then, a couple of weeks later, I'd go back and do it again for a little while, because it's pretty horrible what people have written and done.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, yes, kudos to you for taking up this socially vital issue. Like, I do think that, bringing it to, raising this issue also within the journalistic milieu is also super important, right? So that they are aware of the real life consequences that they, the pieces that they write for the respective newspapers can end up with. But
let me just jump in. I will say one thing about feminist groups across the Pacific Islands are really onto this issue, and there's been some great media training supporting women, running. So radio is still very big in the Pacific Islands. Not everyone reads. They're very disparate, islands all over the place, but radio is a major form of media. And so some feminist radio stations have been set up to kind of bring a different perspective. So that's a great example of how the media can get the message out in a really constructive way. And Pacific women are leading that and have agency and power. And, I really respect the work that those women are doing.
Absolutely. So now, when you were combing through all of those newspaper articles, were you using any specific? Okay, let me give all of the people who are listening to us and watching us a bit of a context. Kate is basically renowned for her love for numbers in terms of statistics and analyzing everything in minute detail. So it was a bit of a spoiler, but still, when you were coming up with all of those statistics that you generated in your research reports, how what kind of tools have you used, and how have you come up with those numbers?
So you know what? I just think that's the funniest thing you could have said, because I feel like I can barely count, and I'm really bad at numbers. So the main tool that I used was a research assistant. But so I won't be able to tell you much about the quantitative analysis, because I really honestly did pay a research assistant to do that, and he knew. I think he used R, which I don't even really know what R is, but it's like a computer thing. But what I did was, what I was looking at was a few key things. So one thing was, how did people get labelled? How was the perpetrator labelled? How was the survivor labelled? And, for example, if there might be a newspaper that's reporting against an assault, reporting on an assault against a child, maybe a 6-year-old girl, and this is where it's just so horrible, but they'll call her a young lady, and it's just ridiculous. It's an infant or a child. And so you look at the actual words that are used to label people. That was one of the main things I was looking at, to see whether they're being labelled correctly. The same thing with the label of the actions. So were they euphemistic, or were they sort of correct labels? And then who's doing what to whom? So where's the power and where's the agency? So those were some of sort of the key things that I was looking for, and then we counted them.
Okay, Kate, I think that, we've talked enough about violence. Let's talk about, well, I'm not going to say anything pleasurable, because COVID is definitely nothing that we hold dear in our hearts. But, well, it's one of your success stories, because it's one of the most often cited papers or quoted papers that you've written recently, right? And it's about communication during the pandemic. And you've analyzed several states and their leaders and how they communicated with the public during the pandemic, right? Yep. So what are the key lessons or takeaways from your findings that we should know about?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for raising that. So I've been part of 2 studies. In the first study, I worked with a colleague here at the University of Queensland, Peter Crosthwaite. He knows numbers. And he and I together compared the Prime Ministers of Australia and New Zealand. And in the other study, Peter and I together collaborated with researchers from Coventry University in the UK, and we compared the First Ministers in Australia, New Zealand, Scotland, and the UK. And I think both of those studies point to the need for clear, succinct, and empathetic crisis communication. Yeah. So those were, we comparing those four leaders, those three things: how clear they were, how succinct they were, and how empathetic they were. They were sort of key differences.
So let's narrow down the perspective a bit to the geographical and political contexts that are near and dear to you. So let's talk a bit about the Prime Minister of New Zealand and Australia. So were there any, noticeable differences, similarities, and what was the impact of those communicative styles?
Yeah, so there are very definitely differences. Jacinda Ardern, as you may have read, sort of went down in history as one of the world-class acts of COVID communication. And Scott Morrison, who is the Prime Minister here in Australia, was widely critiqued for being unclear and unhelpful. So that's what the media has said about the two leaders. So we looked in detail to try and get to know their communicative style a little bit better. And what was it that was so different between them that led to those judgments? And we found that Jacinda Ardern very quickly established and maintained a consistent, highly personal style throughout the pandemic. So her message basically never changed. She said the same thing all the way through. She had an advantage because New Zealand had existing emergency alert systems because of their volcanoes. And she adapted the volcano alert system to the pandemic. And that helped New Zealanders make sense of what was happening. And it helped to guide their behavior very clearly. She gave how-to instructions. So, and in the process, she also prioritized rapport building. So she used a lot of personal pronouns, you, I, we, that helped New Zealanders come together around a common identity. And in that common identity, crisis management was the responsibility of both the government and the population. And, widely very, very successful. By contrast, Scott Morrison, his communication was very reactive to the epidemic curve. So when it was when case numbers were going up, he communicated a certain way, and when they were going down, he communicated differently. And you might say, if you're sort of taking a positive look at that, you might say, well, he was very sensitive to the context and he was responsive to the context and he was dynamic as the crisis unfolded. But the downside of it was that his message was seemingly always changing and people didn't really understand. They were just starting to wrap their head around one message and then the message was different. So that heightened responsiveness to the epidemic curve also increased uncertainty. And on top of that, his messaging was very focused on government structures and not very personal and not very engaging. And so he framed the government as responsible for doing certain things. And, politicians often, it's part of their repertoire to boast about what they've done. My government has done this and this and this. And that's normal in a non-crisis situation. But by talking all the time about what the government was doing and not building those interpersonal relationships, Australians were sort of left really not knowing what they should be doing, especially when the message was changing.
So from what you're saying, Kate, it seems that a bit of this gendered kind of communicative style also trickled into the ways that they communicated with the public, because I would say stereotypically we think about females as report building and males as, focusing on structures, minute details, etc. Would you say that this could be ascribed to the gender of the people whose communicative styles have investigated?
Yeah, they certainly could be. The thing about Jacinda Ardern, and this is not my idea, this is something I've read a few other writers comment on her androgynous leadership style, that she does that stereotypical relational female thing very, very well, but she's also very good at being directive and firm and do this, don't do this. And so, which could be sort of stereotypically perceived as a masculine communication style.
Instead of saying like, would you kindly do that, right?
Yeah. So she was very direct and very clear, but she was also very personable. So she managed to be, as several people have said, she managed to be androgynous.
That's super interesting. It seems that like, she's been extremely aware of how and what to say to to people and what's going to be most effective, right? Because I wouldn't sort of play it down to a mere coincidence of this communicative style just being implemented in this very dire situation, right?
Yeah, that's right. And she's shown herself to be a master communicator in many situations, not just during the pandemic.
Absolutely. Right. So, Kate, being mindful of our time today, I was just wondering whether we could wrap up today's episode with a bit of a pro tip part. There's a lot of fake news, right? Circulating in the world, and especially in the media, obviously, but also social media and grassroots media, whatnot. So in today's information age, how would you say that we can protect ourselves from misinformation or fake news? And so could you offer a bit of a pro tip for us here?
Yeah, very happy to do that. It's such an important question, isn't it? Because more and more people are getting their news through social media. And social media can also spread misinformation very, very quickly and have a really devastating effect on our social life. So I have 4 pro tips for you. And actually, this comes from a research paper by Zhang and Gorbani in 2020. So bear with me. The first pro tip is this. There are a lot of fact checkers available now. They're very easy to use. For example, the Washington Post fact checker. It's an award-winning service. You can email them factchecker@washpost.com and they respond and they check the facts on questions that readers send in to them. They've also produced a really great video called The Fact Checker's Guide to Manipulated Video. So you can learn how to identify if a video that you're watching is manipulated or not. So that's number 1 is fact checkers. They exist, make use of them. Tip number 2, the best way to check your news to see if it's fake is to check who published it. And a lot of people aren't going to do that on social media. The news is just going round and round. But to stop, look at a website. Does the URL look a bit weird? Is there actually an About Us page? Is there actually contact details? Does this look like a reputable website? Is it one of the high reliability media sources on the AdFonts media chart? So that's the second thing, is check your sources. Third thing, read critically. So don't just stop at the headline. Don't flick on, you've read a great headline and you want to tell everybody. Read the whole story. And especially pay attention to how you feel. So, fake news will make you instantly angry or scared or suspicious. So if you get that emotional reaction to something you read, slow down and think why. Why is it doing that? And is it in fact a reliable source? And then fourth thing is put everything that you read in context. So what else has this source published? Do those stories look reputable? Have other sources published the same information, or is this just an outlier? They're the only people saying it. And if other sources have published the same information, who are they? So there's my 4 tips.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, it's like a tool set for everybody who wants to get down to the real to this sort of factual knowledge that's being distributed out there. I can see it. Can we problematize that a bit? Obviously, we're living in the headline culture. People consume headlines and they just stop there, right? What's your take on that? And has it already taken a toll in terms of misinformation?
Having recently analysed 900 odd newspaper articles, it's very, very clear to me that and even just general knowledge, very clear to me that the headline doesn't always represent what's in the story. So the headline is actually a frame that the publisher presents to you, that they want you to read the story through that frame. So imagine a story with a different headline.
Right.
How else could this story be framed? Thinking critically at every level, but especially at the headline.
It seems that we've got a lot to do in terms of sort of instigating this urge to think and read critically in people across the globe. I think it's geography context sort of independent, right? But I think there's just a handful of countries nowadays that within their educational system, the primary or secondary level of education, they actually teach students how to think and read critically. And this is one of those skills that should be at a premium nowadays, shouldn't it?
Absolutely. And my daughter, who's 18 now, constantly teases me. When she was a little girl and we would catch the bus somewhere, there'd be an advertisement at the bus station. And I remember one really clearly. We joke about this. It was an ad for shampoo. And there were some young men and women sort of doing different positions in the ad. And all the girls were upside down in little skimpy clothes. And all the guys were the right way up in kind of normal clothes. And she was probably 5. And I said to her, look at that ad. Why are all the girls upside down? And, such a simple question.
Yeah.
But we can teach our kids. We can teach our teenagers. Why? Why is such a good question.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And you've touched upon yet another interesting topic, that is visual communication. We're definitely not delving into that today. And Kate, thank you so much for talking about so many interesting things about the media. As we said, what they do to us and how we can actually be very critical and mindful of what the motivation of the media outlets can be, right, and journalists included, and even if those journalists are tackling socially volatile, right, issues, they are not necessarily always aware of what kind of effect they might have on the end user, right, on the reader. Thank you so much for that, Kate. I'm gonna keep my fingers crossed, firmly crossed, for more inspiring research coming from Queensland and authored by yourself. Thank you so much. And I look forward to staying in touch with you. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure.